Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. So for generations, police across America have used traffic stops, often triggered by supposed moving violations or things like a broken taillight. They've used them as a pretext to pull people over and kind of see what else they can find. Now, in ordinary scenarios, let's be real, the vast majority of people getting pulled over for broken taillights are people who do not result in anything the police can find. But police use this tactic so often that they might use that ticket or citation attempt to try and turn up other offenses they could use to charge people. Taken as a whole, traffic enforcement has given police a tool to use to sort of crack down on what, if we are being honest, we will call driving while black. Under the guise of keeping the road safe, police in jurisdictions across the U.S. subject disproportionately Black and brown drivers to harassment, criminalization, ticketing, and of course, the ever-present threat of violent, even deadly escalation. In Los Angeles last month, the city council took an important first step towards reining in this sort of biased traffic enforcement, approving a motion to begin exploring civilian traffic enforcement. In other words, putting civilians rather than armed police officers in charge of patrolling traffic. Advocates for this change say it is long overdue. They've cited data showing that Black and brown motorists in LA are targeted in officer-initiated traffic stops at highly disproportionate rates and are far more likely than white motorists to have both their person and property searched during those stops. I will tell you honestly, I lived in LA for years. I am not a good driver, was not pulled over once, and yet I have represented hundreds and hundreds of people whose contact with police started because of a frequently baseless traffic stop. And of course, in cases like Dijon Kizzy's, routine traffic stops like these have turned deadly. Los Angeles Sheriff's deputies shot Kizzy more than a dozen times, including in his back. This was last year after officers stopped him supposedly for riding his bicycle against traffic. For more on the plan to explore civilian alternatives to traffic enforcement in LA, I am joined now by LA City Council member Mike Bonin. Thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So before we talk about the City Council's recent motion, I think it would be great for you to sort of explain to our audience what you're reacting to. And I know that I talked a lot about car stops at the top of the show, but what we're talking about actually extends beyond cars. We're talking about trains. We're talking about buses. Yep. Can you describe what armed law enforcement traffic patrolling has looked like in LA?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the segment and thank you for the question. When the nation suddenly hit this moment of reckoning over race and police last summer, everyone on our council was looking for ways to engage. I chair our transportation committee, and I'm a member of the board that oversees our regional bus and train system. So I decided let's focus on the areas of transportation because so much of the interaction between people of color and law enforcement happens either while driving, while bicycling, while on our trains or buses. And if you do not have freedom of movement, you're not free. And it is a huge problem in Los Angeles. We have had disproportionate enforcement against Black and brown men on our transit system, on questions of fare evasion that often lead to violent incidents. We have had several well-documented incidences in our own police department of the statistics showing that Black neighborhoods are targeted for pretextual traffic stops, and that not only are Black and Latinos more likely to be pulled over and more likely to be subject to an aggressive search, but they are actually less likely than white motorists, when stopped and searched, to have contraband or have some reason to justify the pretext. So it's a huge problem, and it's actually one where there has been the most pushback against reimagining public safety, and partially because when we proposed it, we used the term you did. Everybody else was saying, let's reimagine public safety, let's do unarmed response. We actually labeled the problem of people being pulled over for driving while Black. and that certainly generated some pushback from law enforcement circles.
I'm actually a little bit surprised that it generated that pushback. I feel like it is such. I mean, I will tell you candidly, I've been on a ride along with the LAPD and had an officer tell me about what a game it was to just find any reason you could to pull something. It is not an obscure, like little known fact. It is a very explicit racist practice. But I suppose that when you call it out as such in the political context, that has very different ramifications.
It does. It also, depends on what part of town you're in. I mean, Los Angeles is a very racially segregated city, and there's parts of the city where people are not as familiar with that dynamic. Mm-hmm. And then you have parts of the city where my colleague, my co-sponsor, Marquise Harris Dawson, he's been pulled over repeatedly, and he's been pulled over while an elected official in a city vehicle. And not everybody in Los Angeles is as aware of this problem as they need to be. And the pushback came down to, wait, you're calling us racists. That's what some of the law enforcement circles said. And then others who very candidly said, this is how we catch bad guys. I mean, they would say that. This is how we catch burglars. This is how we catch human traffickers, is we use pretextual stops, and you can't take that tool away from us, is what they would say.
And yet, if, as you say, Black motorists are so much less likely to have contraband, it doesn't really seem like it's a very good tool. So tell me about what's happening in the city council. What's this motion that the city council passed last month? What does it do, and what happens next?
So what the council did is about a month ago is we took what is the first step, and not a tremendously huge step, in transforming how we do things in Los Angeles. We heard very clearly from the community, from impacted frontline communities, from Black and from Brown communities. Don't dictate how we make this change. Listen to us on how you make this change. So the first thing that's happening is our Department of Transportation is actually doing a community engagement process with frontline communities to find out what the real flashpoints are, what are the things we should be addressing first, working with the coalitions that have been concerned about traffic stops, the community-based organizations, and coming up with solutions and alternatives together. Some of those are unarmed enforcement. Some of those may be technological. Some of them may be looking at what different countries or other cities are doing. But we're really trying to listen from the bottom up on how to do this.
Back to that thing you said in your first answer about if you don't have the freedom to move, you're not free. Because I think we're talking about driving while Black, but like riding the bus while Black, riding the train while Black, like movement is really impacted here. And, I have, again, represented lots of people. I've gone to trial on cases that started with an unpaid bus ticket. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing regionally in addition to diminish contact across transit with police officers. And does that incorporate the movement for equitable fares that enable more people to be on the bus without being accused of not paying?
Oh, big question with a lot of movement on what you're just talking about. So this isn't confined to Los Angeles. This is regional. It isn't just in cars. It isn't just on our streets. It is on our transit system as well, buses and trains. And the population of people who use our transit system in Los Angeles are disproportionately Black and Brown, and are disproportionately low income. 70% of the riders make poverty wages or less. We have consistently heard on our transit system that young people, particularly Black and Brown people, feel unsafe. They feel that they are harassed. They feel that they are targeted for fare enforcement stuff. So we, similarly to what we are doing at the city, we have launched a new effort to listen to people on how to come up with a different system. It's a public safety advisory committee made up of riders, made up of people of color, to tell us how to do things differently. And they're coming up with suggestions like activating our stations, bring in musicians and street vendors, fill it with activity, so that their good activity drives out bad activity. They're recommending hire unarmed community ambassadors just to be faces in the system and not people with guns and with badges. And just last week, we approved a motion that I put in to earmark $40 million towards starting to reimagine this. We approved less for the police contract than had been asked, and $40 million to start hiring community ambassadors, to start doing community outreach, to start talking about station activation. At the same time, we're actually pursuing, and hopefully we'll be voting in May, on a proposal from the agency staff to make fares free on our metro system. It's a 1.5-year pilot for students and for low-income riders, which would be, again, 70% of the passengers. And that could actually start going to work in the next year.
So one thing I find really helpful when talking about policy, especially policy that is big and complicated, is understanding your vision as a person might experience it. So I'm hoping you might walk me through if all of what you've discussed just now comes to fruition, and a person is, let's say, a low-income Black student in LA trying to go, from Long Beach to downtown. Can you walk me through what that ideal experience would look like and how it would be different than what they're experiencing right now?
Well, the ideal experience would be that person would arrive at the station. They wouldn't have to take out their tap card. They would go to the train. No one in a uniform would pull them aside and ask to see proof of their fares. They wouldn't get searched if somebody felt they had a bit of an attitude. They would be able to get onto the transit system and ride safely and freely to downtown Los Angeles and have a great day. And the way you phrased the question was significant, because you talked about people's personal experiences, and we have heard a lot of different things from people who have different personal experiences on the transit system. There are older riders who have said, we feel unsafe, we want more security. That manifests differently for that young Black and brown passenger. That voice is now starting to be articulated, and it helps us reimagine a system that might provide safety for the senior citizen in a way that doesn't threaten or imperil or even jeopardize the life of the young Black or brown passenger. And what we've discovered is how you ask people about their experiences matters a real lot. The agency Metro did a survey of passengers and said, do you feel safe? And if they said no, the question was, should we have more cops? People said yes. However, when they did a focus group and they sat down with passengers of the Blue Line and they actually talked to them at length, they found out that was not the preferred option for people. The passengers didn't want to see more armed personnel. They wanted to see ways to make stations friendlier, more active, better lit, with community ambassadors. And they, when you talk to people, defined a different vision for public safety other than armed officers with the authority to use deadly force.
So are there any models? I know you talked about being really community rooted, and it sounds like you're getting a lot of constituent feedback, but I'm wondering, I know in Berkeley, there are plans percolating to have unarmed employees of a newly formed Department of Transportation replace police. Can you tell us if you're drawing inspiration or coordinating with any other geographies?
Yeah, we're looking at any different example that we can and sort of putting everything into the hopper. The community ambassadors that we have just approved funding for on Metro, the transit agency, that's an idea that they started implementing recently on the BART in San Francisco. For our city approach to decriminalizing routine traffic stuff like a broken taillight or a DUI, there are different models in Europe where if you have a broken taillight, someone may pull you over, but they help you repair the light and they send you on your way. Or there's different models in different European cities where we found somebody with a DUI. They actually they drive you home and they don't wind up throwing you into jail. So there's a whole bunch of different ways, and we're trying to pull in whatever we see as an example from a different jurisdiction, locally or internationally, and then let the community weigh in on what makes sense to them.
So, turning then to this narrative that one hears from supporters of the status quo that traffic enforcement is inherently dangerous or high risk and therefore requires armed officers to be present. What is your response to that argument?
Well, the thing about that argument is you can hear that about everything. There is not a situation in the world where there is not some chance of someone being violent, whether it's a domestic disturbance, whether it's a traffic thing, whether it's a crowd at a soccer game or a baseball game. But we don't want to be a society that sort of has a military style occupation of every public space and every public event. Most traffic stops do not result in violence and do not require armed enforcement. Some of those can be done automatically. Some of those can be done with civilians. We're not saying that you necessarily need to have civilians dealing with somebody who's doing a high-speed chase going 90 mile per hour through different neighborhoods in Los Angeles. But for instance, very low-hanging fruit in Los Angeles is when there's a traffic collision in Los Angeles, particularly a minor traffic collision. Why in God's name do we need 2 or 3 police cars with 2, 4, 6 different personnel responding to that? That can be done by civilians. That can be done by computer. There are so many different ways where we can take out the risk of racial bias and of violent confrontation by just doing things differently and generally more cost effectively.
I have to ask a really pointed question because I think it's important. But when you describe those like 2 or 3 cop cars parked at like a fender bender and people are just kind of like letting the hours pass them by in the day as they stand there on the job, I have to ask, when I think about traffic stops, I think about a lot of what I would categorize as like police low-hanging fruit, right? Like you might find somebody who's got an outstanding warrant. You might find somebody who has, a BB gun. Like there's all of this really low level, very easy to police stuff that bulks up like an officer's overtime hours and like the things they can check off their quotas, if you will. Whereas the other stuff, if we take all of that off the police plate, the stuff that's left, which is a real minority of criminal behavior, but it's a perhaps higher priority category, violent crimes, homicides, sexual assault, things like that. Those are much harder to tackle as police officers. So I want to ask, are you getting any pushback? I mean, this change takes away a lot of easy stuff from police and perhaps forces the focus onto harder stuff. How are you navigating that conversation?
There has been a lot of pushback. Navigating it, it's been choppy waters. The pushback has been pretty extreme. Our police union has come out swinging. They've done mailers against me. They've done billboards against me and a couple of my colleagues. The pushback has been pretty aggressive. But I'm finding, even though they certainly have a very big megaphone and a big following, that if you have the conversation with people about what the right deployment of resources is, they tend to agree with the idea of moving armed law enforcement out of traffic and transportation issues. I represent a very white, relatively affluent part of town. In the middle of the reimagining public safety discussions last spring and summer, I surveyed my constituents, and instead of asking the question of here's a problem, should we send cops, I asked, here's a problem, who should we send? And presented a variety of scenarios for each of them. And except for like a burglary in progress or a violent crime like murder or aggravated assault, people did not say, send the police. By large numbers in each situation, they said somebody else. And people in some of the neighborhoods I represent that don't want to abolish or defund, but want to see more neighborhood patrols, they get that if you are not using police for everything under the sun, from traffic control at a sporting event to an off-leash dog to a domestic disturbance to somebody having a mental health crisis to somebody with a broken taillight, if you don't use cops for all that, you're going to get better 911 response times for the burglary or for the violent crime, or you're going to have more resources to investigate human trafficking. And so I think most people get that there's a better way to do things than the way we are right now. It's about creating the space for the longer conversation so that you can get past the here's a problem, do we send cops, to here's a problem, what's the right response to it?
Well, Councilmember Bonin, I'm very happy that you are having that conversation and tackling these really hard questions. And I wish you the very best of luck in getting this vision to reality. And I'm really glad that you stopped by to talk with me, and hope we'll get to have you back on the show soon to update us on how your progress has gone.
Would love to. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for all that you do.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
So this is another iteration of something we're seeing all across the country, which is local legislators and officials elected to keep people safe, coming up with really interesting, creative solutions to do better. It's something we see far too little of in the field of criminal law, where so much of our policy and so much of our structure is based on what people are scared of, what they are mad at, and what makes people's gut feel good. When in fact, we need to be thinking critically about what are people actually experiencing and what will actually make communities safer. In this case, we heard from Councilmember Bonin about how Black motorists and Black transit riders, Black and brown people in Los Angeles are not free to move about the county. And if people are not free to move, they are not free. He does not want to see a world in which, in a, as he described, I think, a military-style occupation, people are being stopped and frisked through the transit system. The experience he describes, the alternative, is very hard to put down. An experience in which people feel safe to enter the system, in which everyone, regardless of income, is able to access transit, in which there's no more fear of armed contact with armed agents, but instead safe professionals helping people use the system, ensuring that it's used appropriately, and not creating conflict and danger in a context where people should not be afraid. As the council member pointed out, most traffic stops actually don't result in violence. The vast majority of traffic stops are of Black and brown people, but actually Black and brown people are far less likely to have any contraband or be doing anything wrong. White people are more likely to actually have some other reason that police can arrest them for, charge during a traffic stop. So what's interesting is when you take a step back and you look at the data and you look at the way the system is working in Los Angeles right now, you see that there are better ways to do this. That having, as he described, what constituents actually want, which is alternate, non-police, unarmed professionals, handling all the little stuff, handling the traffic stops, handling the mental health calls, handling conflict resolution in ways that are not requiring a police presence, is better and keeps people safer from police violence. Police, for their part, may be able to focus on more important things if the council member is able to realize his vision. So we're very, very grateful that we had a chance to talk about what's happening in Los Angeles. And you can follow LA and all the other jurisdictions where cool things are happening right here on the Appeal Live. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. Have a good night.